Um, I think we can get on to our first topic and we can start rolling
Yeah.
that timer. We are going to do our fucking damnedest to stay on a tighter time schedule. Why? Because we know that y'all don't have all night, we don't have all night, and when you're listening back to this, either you're listening to it while you're taking a shower, which is when I listen to, Up First on NPR, right? 15 minutes, I'm in and out of the shower, toothbrushed and ready to go, which is super nice. That amount of time and that like level of info is the sweet spot, and so we're gonna try and hit that as best we can, with a little bit of help from some clocks and keeping each other on pace. So we'll see how we do. All right, let's get it going with topic number
So we're
one,
starting.
which is all about the recent NBA playoff strike. It was one of these kind of monumental events, of recent memory that struck a lot of people differently, but is something that warrants at least acknowledgement and a little bit of exploration. In part because it relates to the other two topics we're going to get into this evening,
Mhm.
um, but just it. I guess I hate using the word unprecedented now. It kind of rubs me the wrong way. I'm like over the word unprecedented. Um,
Yeah,
but
right.
to engage in a slew of wildcat strikes the way that they did was really important, and sort of
Yeah.
sending a message and setting a tone for what our current social situation is, right? And so the strikes, they began with the Milwaukee Bucks, in direct response to the shooting of Jacob Blake, right? They saw this violent atrocity happen, saw the sort of lack of I don't know, acknowledgement, I guess. Um, kind of the country over, outside of like the population of Kenosha and the the news outlets that were blasting it here and there, as details were coming up, and the ways in which it was being reported obviously have always been really complicated. And Giannis and a couple other teammates were not having it and said that they would not play in their game, right? And that led to teams following suit. The WNBA, already massive advocates for anti-racism and Black Lives Matter, came prepared with their shirts with the bullet holes on the back, with Jacob Blake's name spelled out, on the front, and read their statement about how they wanted change and were also going to join the NBA players in boycott or in striking, right? And and it set off a lot of important conversations in that moment, right? One, about the distinction between a boycott and a strike, which was a really important distinction that actually, until AOC pointed it out on Twitter, I like really wasn't that privy, probably because I haven't read enough labor material. Um, but to know that like a boycott is about withholding money from a purchase, whereas a strike is about withholding labor, and what the players did by not taking the court that night was to withhold their labor as athletes against the policies and permissions of their union, and said no, we will not play, right, at risk of whatever was going to happen to their careers.
Right.
They decided
Right.
that they were not going to play, and um, it ended up rippling out to the other leagues, right? Slowly but surely, the MLB games were taken off. The Brewers paid respects, before their game started, and some of the other leagues like the NHL actually did a pretty shit job of of following up. There were some games that same night that started without a hitch, no moment of silence, no recognition. They just played the anthems and jumped right into it. Um, and I don't know. I guess this is where the I guess the discussion for me should start. Is like, was it was it because the NBA is probably one of the most black athlete populated sports, that like the response was just so swift and so direct, and like in the other sports arenas, like baseball being heavily Latino and Hispanic, and hockey being particularly, you know um, Caucasian and like Eastern European and Slavic, right? That like the responses were so varied. Like, are we just gonna be able to root it down to like the player base? Or is there something deeper about like the nature of the league? Talking a little bit about sports in general, the way we did last week. Like, is there something about the sports themselves that made them more or less receptive to taking on this issue?
Mhm. Muffin, I don't. The sports I follow religiously are more obscure. Like I'm a super casual Sixers fan, casual Flyers fan, even though they're doing very well. So I don't know that I'm in any position to speak to the leagues per se, but I think there is something to be said, one, about the blackness of the NBA,
Mm-hmm.
right? And the blackness of the NFL as well, right? Who served as sort of, I think, like precursor to this in some ways, right? When we think about like athletes using their position, their publicity, um, to generate like advocacy and consciousness raising. Um, but I think beyond the blackness of the player base, I think there's something to be said about the how basketball figures in Black American culture and African American culture. Um, and so I think it's a confluence of uh, basketball's like cultural significance, the player base, and who was it? I think was it Kushner who said like, "Oh, that's cute. Like these guys are taking a day off from work when they make like hundreds of millions of dollars." Um, and I think that of course, like, yeah, yes, do these players make incredible amounts of money? Of course they do. Um, that doesn't then like unblacken them, right? That doesn't somehow reduce the psychic and cognitive harm of the summer that we've had, right? Like of having to be inundated with black brutality in the way that we have been. Which, to be clear, like there's no golden hour, right, for anti-blackness in this country. We haven't gotten there yet. And so there's no reference point that we can say like that was better. But I think in the context of COVID, in the context of the Trump presidency, um, there's like a hyper awareness, I think, around anti-blackness, that's unlike any other time, at least in I think our lifetimes. And so it's a confluence for me, from my vantage point. It's a confluence of those pieces. Um, and yeah, I mean, do players bring up um, political issues all the time? I couldn't tell you the last time players went on a strike. Um, and so it was incredible to watch.
I remember people saying it had been like I was watching the Daily Show and questions were being raised by like he played a clip I think from Fox News and they were like, oh, so we're just like gonna decide whether or not we play sports on the political opinions of the day. And Trevor was like, yeah, maybe we should. Like maybe you shouldn't get to watch you know the players that you claim to love so much on the days that
Mhm.
you're that the country and other people are being assholes about them and people like them and their experience, right? And so it brings up two issues. I think one that you mentioned about how players are told they make enough money to, engage in political commentary like this and say like
Yeah,
they can take a day off because they
yeah.
have
Or to
multi-million
jump
dollar
the puddle
contracts.
of racism, right?
Right,
Like you've earned your way across that.
right. And one of the things I think that came up in the episode of United States of America that I was watching and catching up on was this idea that at some point of affluence, you are no longer capable of filing a complaint,
Right.
right? That if you reach a economic pinnacle as a black or brown person, then your opinion is moot on the subject of racism because
Mhm.
you now become the exception to the rule, and so you can't
Yeah.
start bitching and moaning. It got said I think when Doc Rivers was talking about his opinions on the situation, and people were like he shouldn't be complaining. He's got all this money. He has a wonderful career. Like it's all fine. And I don't really understand how money absolves you of understanding the situation, of experiencing the situation prior to any
Yeah.
sort of success that you've achieved, and it doesn't protect you from experiencing it after the fact.
No, no, not at all. Not at all. And we see this. I mean, we've seen empirical studies of this, right? We've seen how black applicants, the social scientists will send out two resumes that are sort of, in terms of credentials, um, identical, but you've got a Jaquan Jackson and a Jamie Stevens, and we see the different rates at which they're that are called back, right? We see that black folk don't get to earn their way out of racism. It's just it's a bankrupt idea. Um, One of my mentors when I was in college was the CFO of Dickinson College, and immaculately well dressed, articulate, right? The same things we say about every other high flying, high achieving black person.
Mm-hmm.
Dope as shit. And he wore his ID around his neck like a dumb freshman, and we used to roast him about it. And one day he was like, "What do you like? What do you mean? Do you think that when I need to come back to my office to go pick up some files I forgot to bring home, that security officer is gonna see CFO? He's gonna see a black guy at night at a ritzy white college.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think I want to reach for my wallet in that moment?" And he was part of a group. He was part of a group of that centered mentoring uh, men of color at Dickinson. And all like we all knew better, but to hear it from somebody who sat that high in the hierarchy of the administration was a total gut punch. He was like, you think I get a fucking pass because of my paycheck and my position?
Mm-hmm.
No, I don't.
And then I think the flip side of that has to do with that paycheck and what it does to people's perceptions of black and brown bodies and what they're worth, I think, to other people.
Yeah,
With athletes in particular, we know that they make on the regular pretty exorbitant amounts of money, but
sure.
that that comes with, I think, a sort of shadowy price tag that doesn't get discussed, and I think
Mm-hmm.
only really gets illuminated in something like Get Out, right, where you start to see people actually bidding on black bodies,
Mm-hmm.
recognizing them for their prowess, their physicality, all these things that the fictional people in the film don't possess because they're all white, and it really isn't that different from the ways in which the NBA, the NFL, right, baseball with all Latino players, the way that those bodies are glorified and a price tag is put on them to say, I want to consume this, right? I want to pay money for this thing,
Mm-hmm.
and sort of stripping it, I think, of a level of humanity at that same
Mm-hmm.
moment to say that this is
Yeah.
just an item, not a person. It is
Yeah.
a spectacle that I get to enjoy. There's
Right.
no entity that's attached to it that can
Mm-hmm.
have thoughts or feelings or opinions on the
Right.
world around them.
Right. And that the moment that you do is to dispel the fantasy of of the athlete superstar, right? The moment that you decide that you're not going to dunk basketballs anymore because you're going to kneel and you're going to bring attention to the precarity of black people that you've you failed to hold up your end of the bargain, right? We've pulled you out of the trenches of blackness. We've conferred upon you tens of millions of dollars, and it's almost like a hidden bargain, right? The undisclosed trade agreement there is that you shut your fucking mouth about race. And when that mystique is dispelled, right? When the mystique of like black exceptionalism is dispelled, people bristle, people get angry. The level of vitriol that a lot of these people are met with, to me, always makes me take pause. The level of entitlement to expect that human beings might have like that somehow we've paid for them to become apolitical, um, is always interesting to see people like really firmly believe that, like, shut the fuck up, dribble a basketball.
Right? I think it was you that told me that you have asked students the question before, like how much money would you need to be black?
I have, yeah.
Um,
And it's always an interesting thought exercise year after year, um, because and it's an exercise that I've done because I I think teaching in the university setting, teaching about race, I think the first 5 weeks are generating buy-in. It's
mhm,
getting kids to suspend disbelief. You're going to get some kids who are like, oh, this is super, holy shit, I've never thought about this way. And then you're going to get other kids who are just like, no, this isn't real. It might have been real in the 1960s, but this isn't real anymore. And so you have to tease out of them like this disbelief. And oftentimes, when I make the case that, well, no, people of color continue to experience disadvantage in a historically white supremacist nation, they're like, but how? I don't have any privilege, right? And they elucidate all of, they pull all of the exceptional examples, but LeBron James, but Obama, but Oprah, right? And I'm sitting here thinking like, I don't make Oprah money, dog. And so I pose the question to get them to experience the ambush of whiteness, right? They're 20 years old. They've got, say, another 50, right? If we're being really, really conservative, what would you need to be paid to be black for the next 50 years of your life? And when you frame it that way, then all of a sudden it has value. And what they recognize is the value of their whiteness, right? Because it's the compensation for trading, right? The 5 million, and that's the thing. I've gotten kids who say, I want $5 million per year lived, 5 million per year to be black for the next 50. And so when I get them to unpack, right, like that designation, then they're like, oh shit, maybe I'm really super racist. Yeah. I mean, very rarely do they have that like one
Yeah,
for one
that seems a bit heavy-handed.
realization, but it is like a running into the wall kind of moment, and it's always super generative. And I think some kids feel really guilty after it. Others just like are so taken aback it takes them a while to process.
And you got to wonder how much of asking for such a figure is rooted in that same sort of I've seen the whoever my favorite non-white athlete is get paid X, Y, and Z amount of money. I feel like if I'm not going to play professional sport but I'm going to live their life, this is probably an approximation of how much I should be getting to
Mm-hmm.
to go through the world in that way, right? Like
Yeah.
I'd be hard pressed to believe all the kids out there who've ever played Madden or NBA 2K, like when they played the franchise mode and they're buying and selling people that don't exist, and they're
Mm-hmm.
like, oh yeah, like I'm gonna finagle the numbers here in my favor. Um, but I I always also then think like, would some players, some professionals take a L to compensate for how other non-white athletes have like are being treated or have to deal with the league and the world around them, right? Like, let's say the the ruling was that all all players in the NFL had to compensate for the amount of missed salary Colin Kaepernick has had up to this point,
You're
right?
bringing up
Like
the R word, Mothman.
so I was about to say, right? It is essentially like a microcosm of reparations, right? Um, how then do we determine what he was worth over all that time, and who has to pay the most of it?
That's,
Because
I think, an impossible question.
a lot of that just be like, no, 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 like you can't compensate for what I've been doing all this time, right? For what he might have done had he not
Mhm.
taken a political stand,
Right.
right? Like he he was incredible. Like would his contract have reached those like peak levels of value
Hmm.
that are
Hmm.
comparable to the Drew Breeses of the world? And his name
Yeah.
comes to mind immediately because of how he got so much flack for his lack of perspective on the situation.
Yeah. Well, and I think that's one way of valuing it, right? It's saying like, raising the question of like, what would Kaepernick's contract have been worth in later phases of his career? Would he have been able to get better? Would he have suffered? Right? Like you go into all of these like what if scenarios.
If he had
But I
chosen
think
not to be human, right? Like,
right. But I think the real question is, it's not merely like can we project the value of his contract? It's what was the cost of the blackball itself,
mm-hmm.
right? And I think that's one of those things that's like really hard to put a number to, right? Because you could just take right? There's all kinds of modeling you could do, right? You could have looked at his stats in his last season and then found a comparable player, right, and projected. Like there are all kinds of things, all kinds of modeling that you could have done to come up with a figure, a number. We owe Kaepernick X number of dollars because we project that he would have earned, given his last season of play, would have earned X number of dollars over the like that's actually easy. What do we like? How do we appreciate, like literally give assign value to having been treated in the way that he was? And I that becomes, I think that becomes really hard to do.
Mm-hmm.
I do an exercise in Peace and Justice where we create like an algorithm for for calculating reparations, and we come up with a figure and we compound it 1% per year. This is also the end of this unit, just an
Got it.
FYI.
Yep, yep. This will be where we end.
Um, and so we and the number is in the trillions, right? And then I always ask my students, okay, so this is, and the way we calculate it is like number of enslaved people, um, plus the free market value, um, of 40 acres and a mule. All of this adjusted for $20, compounded by, um, you multiply those first two numbers, then you compound it by 1% per year, for every year since the end of the Civil War. It's an enormous number. And in fact, maybe what I do tonight is post that figure. I have the math somewhere in one of my teaching files. But the final question is always, and then how do we value? How do we account for the millions of lives lost, the intergenerational suffering and trauma, the hundreds of people who launched themselves from the sides of ships, knowing that death was better than bondage? How do you account for that, in terms of reparations? And whatever number we come up with, it's too cheap. It's too small.
Whether or not you intended to do it, your quote there gives us a perfect segue into our discussion about Chadwick Boseman and Black Panther and representation.
I saw it and I went. I
Yeah,
saw it and I
and you
went.
saw the lines, right?